Committee.
We'll need to all squeeze in at the back. Huddle up. Order, order. We're now in public session. Welcome, Home Secretary, to our deliberations. You gave us a very tight deadline to review the bill. We have been assiduous in covering all aspects of it, we believe. We've held 3 evidence sessions per week so that we could have as thorough an understanding as possible. We've collected thousands of pages of evidence, and we are now at the end of our evidence gathering session. So we're very grateful to have you with us today. That's all from me. Could I move over? Do you have any opening statement, Home Secretary?
No, Chairman. Safe to say that I am conscious of the tight deadline that we set to you, and I'm also very conscious of the diligent way in which the committee has been proceeding with its scrutiny.
Thank you very much, Home Secretary. We'll move on to questions. And Mr. Ellis, if you would begin.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. Home Secretary, good afternoon. We heard from senior police officers yesterday who, amongst other of our witnesses, have spoken powerfully about the operational need for a bill along these lines. One of the concerns that has been expressed to us by witnesses, some witnesses, and by others, has been the breadth of the powers that are given to the Secretary of State by Clause 1 of this current draft. Now, your officials, the Home Office officials that came before us recently, said that this was an issue of drafting rather than intent, and clearly we appreciate that this is a draft bill. But they said they would be going back to ministers about this. I just wanted to ask you, do you accept that Clause 1 is wider, or can be interpreted to be wider in its current drafting than it need be?
Well, certainly I'm aware that there's been a lot of discussion around Clause 1 and the interpretation of Clause 1. And from what I can see, people have been interpreting it in a way which was not intended when it was drafted. And certainly I think we would be willing to look at the drafting to make sure that that is perhaps meets our needs and cannot be misinterpreted in the way that it has been. There is, however, an element to Clause 1 where I think it is important that we have a degree of flexibility within it. I think it's about getting that balance right. But it is important, I think, that we, as things are ever moving in the technological field, that we are able to build into the bill a degree of flexibility subject to appropriate procedures and so forth in future, and obviously the orders and so forth will go through parliamentary processes. But that flexibility enables us not to have to constantly come back on if there's too tight a definition.
Because of the speed in the advance of this area of technology.
That's right. I mean, we are able, obviously, we know what we know now. We can do a certain amount of prediction for the future, but of course, even by the time the bill would come in on a normal timetable, were it to be introduced, obviously, in this session or the next session, it would be a few years on before this came into play, and by that time things could have changed, and having the ability to have that flexibility as technology changes, I think is important, because the aim of this, as I think everybody knows, is to ensure that our law enforcement agencies can carry on having access to the data that they find so necessary operationally in terms of investigations and catching criminals and saving lives.
Thank you. Now, some of the CSPs have told us that what your officials have proposed in private discussion seems to them to be narrow, proportionate, reasonable, but they have a concern that the bill will empower a Secretary of State to do more, to do a good deal more. And so assurances about the way it's intended to use powers do not necessarily preclude the possibility of abuse in the future. So I wondered if you had anything to say, any observations about the possibilities of abuse and the protections that you feel are in place to prevent abuse should there be any attempt to misuse powers in this area in the future.
Well, the first comment I would make is that obviously we've had a number of discussions with a number of CSPs over time leading up to this draft bill. I am absolutely clear that the key issues, the key reasons we want the data, the key data we want is the who, when, where, how. And that's clear, and there is no intention of going beyond that, going beyond into content or anything. So there is a limited scope for the data that we want to have access to. And we've been very clear about that at every stage, I think, and the bill is not intended to take us any further than that.
Thank you, Home Secretary. Lord Chairman.
Thank you very much. Lord Strasburger.
Good afternoon, Home Secretary.
Good afternoon.
Very pleased to hear what you have to say about not wanting to capture content. I mean, what I say in my emails is my business and not the state's. Similarly, would you agree with me that records of which websites you or I or anyone in this room visits, for example, perhaps Alcoholics Anonymous or sites about coping with mental illness, could reveal very private information about the person's life, and in reality is content, and so should be outside the scope of the bill?
Well, I'm grateful to you, Lord Strasburg, for giving me another opportunity to confirm that we don't want to look at the content of people's emails. This sadly is one of the myths that has appeared in public, and I can reiterate that that is not what this bill is about. The issue in relation to the websites that somebody has visited, I mean, first of all, we are not in the business either of trying to get into information about sort of personal details about individuals. As I say, communications data is about the who, when, where and how. But if somebody has visited a particular website, that may actually be relevant to an investigation. If CEOP is investigating a ring of child abusers, the fact that an individual has accessed a website which shows photographs of child abuse may be relevant to that investigation.
Thank you. We've heard that the use of DPI black boxes at service providers to monitor internet activity at a national scale is currently only being done in China, Iran and Kazakhstan. How do you feel about the prospect of the UK becoming the first democracy to join them?
Well, there's been quite a lot of discussion about the technicalities of how this operation, the access to the CD, will be undertaken. And I'm sure you've had quite a lot of evidence about exactly what those technicalities will be. And I think all I will say in response is that obviously we can go into more technical detail for you if you would like, but I don't perceive what is going to happen as a result of this bill in quite the terms that you do in the way in which you've asked the question. But I'm very happy to come back in writing or for another private session where we can go into more of the technicalities of exactly what is going to be done.
Yeah, we have had some difficulty in extracting from your officials the comparative information in terms of what is being done elsewhere in the world. This is the information that we've heard from other witnesses, that there's no democracy in the world currently using or contemplating such draconian measures.
I'm very happy, if the committee is happy, Lord Blencathra, to write to the committee with some further detail.
As urgently as possible. Yeah.
During the public evidence session last week, your officials confirmed that, as was stated in your written evidence, the data gaps which you are currently seeking to fill are subscriber data relating to IP addresses and weblogs. Is there any reason why these, and access to third-party data, should not be stated in the bill as being the only new matters for which access is permissible?
Well, I think it relates to an earlier answer I gave Mr. Ellis, which is about the need for flexibility as we see technology developing. If we put on the face of the bill the requirements, the gap requirements that we have today, I mean, there are other issues about putting gap requirements on the face of the bill as well in terms of some of the messages it sends. But if we were to put those very specific requirements on the face of the bill today, actually that might solve today's problem, but in a few years' time, we might need the flexibility to be able to deal with some other aspect of data. And I'm very conscious, I mean, the reason for bringing the bill forward is that we are seeing a degradation in our ability to access important data which is needed operationally to catch criminals.
Holmes, what if those elements were in an order-making power in the bill, which could be amended very rapidly and brought before Parliament? I appreciate if it's in the main act of Parliament, one waits sometimes a few years to get a REPA-type bill. Would you be happier with that then?
I think, as I say, there may be some other arguments for not always specifying where you think your gap is.
That's true.
In terms of the message it sends to everybody as to what they can suddenly start using. But certainly, I mean, I think there would be a difference, obviously, between having it on primary legislation and having it in some ability for secondary legislation with Parliament to look at it.
It would solve the problem of future-proofing, having an order-making power which could rapidly plug some of these technological changes, could deal with the future-proofing problem. I think we accept your point. You might not want to see it for other reasons.
It's certainly, I mean, that would be a way of enabling Parliament to have a look at any future-proofing requirements. I mean, I think I come back to the point that I think there is an advantage and a benefit to us for being able to retain sufficient degree of flexibility in the bill itself, that we do not find ourselves hamstrung in the future in the way that we are at the moment.
Lord Jones.
Lord Chairman, Home Secretary, we understand that one reason the powers have been so broadly drafted is to attempt to deal with future developments in communication and without having to go back to Parliament. That's how we've seen it. And the committee wonders, wouldn't it be better to devise a procedure for parliamentary approval which is more rigorous than affirmative resolution, but less time-consuming, say, than primary legislation? Would you entertain that?
Well, I can well see that the committee might wish to look at an issue like that. I'm not quite sure what that procedure could or might be. And I come back to my point that I said right at the beginning, that I do think that flexibility sufficient to allow change to take place to meet growing technological needs is important. Otherwise, we see criminals slipping through the net.
Well, there are two former chief whips here that could be of service on parliamentary procedures, but my second...
Former chief whips can be of service in many ways, Lord Jones.
That's how I found it when I was in the other place. My second question is, would a possible procedure be consideration by a parliamentary committee with power to call for evidence and to make recommendations to which the government should reply?
Well, there are obviously a number of, if you were going to go down that route of some parliamentary procedure, there are a number of ways in which that could be done. But I come back to my central point, which is that at any point in time, what we want to be able to do is to ensure that our law enforcement agencies have the powers necessary to them to do the job we want them to do of catching criminals, saving lives, and any procedure that takes a significant amount of time and that means that we see criminals slipping through the net, as I said, I think we would be concerned about.
Lord Armstrong.
Secretary of State, I quite see the need for flexibility in Clause 1 and that you have been speaking about. But of course, the more flexible it is, the greater the concern that it gives rise to about possible intrusions on privacy. And there's a balance there to be struck, which it is for Parliament and for you to strike. I wonder if you would like to comment on that aspect of it, and whether, if there could be some procedure whereby you could move very quickly to extend the powers, it would be acceptable to have a narrower degree of flexibility.
Well, I think in a sense, if I may say so, Lord Armstrong, you've hit the nail on the head in that this is, as you say, a balance between protection of privacy and the issue of government being able to ensure the law enforcement agencies have the powers that they need. As I say, my concern is to ensure that there is sufficient flexibility, that we don't just find ourselves introducing a bill that, as soon as it's come into play, has gaps in it and has only achieved a limited extension of the ability of the law enforcement agencies to do their job. Obviously, I mean, if the committee, from the nature of the questions, will be looking at other procedures that could take place to reduce that flexibility. I mean, we will obviously look at any ideas that the committee brings forward, but it is where that balance, as you say, it's where that balance lies that I think is the crucial issue.
That's very helpful, Home Secretary. Mr. Wright?
Lord Chairman, Home Secretary, I welcome your opening remarks about the scope of what the Home Office wants to secure in terms of this legislation. My concern would be perhaps coming at it from a slightly different angle. As technology does change and content becomes more and more difficult to draw out, the more it merges in terms of data, in terms of content, subscriber data, the more technology merges all of this information. Aren't you concerned that actually you'll end up in a position where, because of the wide scope of the bill, but your direction to want to ensure that content isn't included, you'll find yourself hamstrung? So that's the other side of the argument, that it could go either way here, and giving a future Home Secretary or yourself the capacity to come back to Parliament to confirm the types of communications data that you want may actually be quite useful.
You're tempting me down a road, Mr. Wright.
I'm trying to.
Yes. I think obviously one of the issues that is already in play is this question of how, given that we only want certain information, how you separate that from content. And obviously we spent quite a long time looking at the technology on this, and I think it's clear, and I think it's been clear from some of the technical experts that have given evidence to the committee, that it is possible to separate content out from the who, when, where and how. So I'm reasonably confident in terms of that. Now you're talking about maybe some years down the line.
5 years down the line we get
as to
a piece of kit that changes the whole parameter of the game. I mean, that's the problem, isn't it?
I think at that stage, I mean, if it was not possible to, at some stage in the future, if it became the case that you could never separate content from the communications data, as we describe it, then I think that would be a different discussion that would need to be had.
Thank you. Baroness Cohen, what are you on this point?
Secretary, we're all kind of generally on the side we feel that the British public would like policemen and security services and proper authorities to be able to access the data they want. And yet, we're all dead against, on the whole, we don't really believe in the concept of future-proofing. We think that that's where the difficulty lies. In your trying to do that, you are alarming, probably unnecessarily, the civil rights people. All of us who are interested in civil rights, that the wide flexibility, if misused, really will give trouble. So that I guess I'm really commenting that this is going to be an urgent one to solve. And while we are, I think, on the same side, this one is going to be difficult to solve.
Okay.
I accept the point, and I think certainly one of the issues that has come through quite clearly is this question of drafting, and has the way in which the clause been set given rise to concerns which need not be there in terms of the intention of the government. And that's why certainly this is one of the issues that we're willing to look at, to make sure that we have got the best drafting to relay our intention and not to raise those sorts of concerns from people.
Fairly certain, Home Secretary, this is an area in which the committee will be commenting. Now, I'm conscious you're suffering from a very heavy cold or maybe even flu,
yes.
And we've only got this tepid water. If you want anything better, if you need tea or coffee or any hot drink or anything,
I thought you would make another suggestion.
I don't care what our rules are. Please feel free to ask your private secretary to get you any refreshment which helps your throat for the next hour and a half. Mr. Mosley.
Thank you. We've received written evidence from the intelligence and security services saying that they believe that they need the full range of powers that are detailed in this bill. Now, the Lord Chairman's asked yourself if we could have permission to interview formally those services, either in public or private, and you've turned us down. So if they were here, I would want to ask them if they could explain to us why any lesser powers would be inadequate.
Well, to address the point that is made about the appearance or not of the not as the case is of the security and intelligence agencies. I mean, one of the reasons why I asked the Intelligence and Security Committee to do a separate and parallel piece of work and to liaise with this joint scrutiny committee is because I recognise that there would be certain issues which could not be not only not revealed in private session to this committee, but can only be revealed to a committee such as to the Intelligence and Security Committee, whose job it is obviously to oversee the security and intelligence agencies. I think my answer to why it is necessary to have these powers and why it would not be possible to have lesser powers is that, I mean, if we just look at what we're trying to do, we're trying to say, what we're saying is, at the moment, the law enforcement agencies, the security agencies have access to certain data that enables them to pursue investigations. I think the figure is that 95% of serious crime investigations over the last 10 years have involved some form of communications data in every major terrorist investigation. So this is data that is currently necessary and used by the agencies. What we want to do, obviously, is to make sure that as the technology develops and people communicate in different ways, they're able to have access to the same type of information on these different forms of communication. And so I think the answer to your question would be, is that if they were only able to have something less than that, that would effectively be the equivalent of a degradation of their abilities.
Thank you, Home Secretary. Dr. Hubbard.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. It's good to see you here, Home Secretary. Can I firstly clear something up? In The Sun on the 3rd of April, you wrote that only suspected terrorists, paedophiles or serious criminals would be investigated using this bill. Clause 9 is currently written very much broader than that. Do you think we should therefore be recommending that Clause 9 be redrafted to tighten it to your stated intention?
I will have a look at... sorry. Everybody's going down with it. We've certainly got no intention of setting out any permitted purposes beyond those that are in the draft bill. But obviously, what we're looking at in relation to that, there is one addition to the purposes that have gone in different from those that exist at the moment, in that we're putting in a reference to the Financial Services Authority, which replaces something that's being repealed in the Financial Services Bill in relation to market exposure. But again, it's back to this issue, in a sense, that the more you prescribe on the face of the bill, the more it does tighten your hands, and the more difficult it makes it if there is, in due course, a scope that needs to be extended to.
But can we just be clear on your intention? Is it your intention this bill would only be used, as you wrote in The Sun, for suspected terrorists, paedophiles or serious criminals?
Well, that is the current scope of the way in which the use is made. There are obviously some other authorities at the moment, public authorities, who have access to communications data, beyond those that are on the face of this bill. As you will know, that is, and have been doing an exercise to look at those bodies to see whether it is right that they be given the powers that are in the bill. I think it is true to say that some of those bodies, you might find it difficult to describe the individuals concerned in those three categories. But the main purpose of the bill is certainly to cover the categories of people that I set out in that article.
If I can then move on to the obligations that this would impose on telecommunications providers. We've heard from a whole range of them, both domestic and overseas, that it would potentially involve restructuring their systems, very large expenditure, which they would be reimbursed from the public purse. There's also been an issue that they say, to summarise a whole lot of different responses, there haven't been that many clear consultations, and I know your officials say there have been, and there's a discrepancy there. But Charles Farwin, he appeared last week, accepted there should be much further consultation on the detail of the bill. If this bill does proceed any further, how will you engage with them, consult with them, so that if the bill does make any progress, they would say that there has been proper consultation, they understand what's proposed?
Well, I think we have had good discussions with a number of CSPs in the run-up to this bill being drafted and published. We would certainly aim to continue that. I mean, obviously, going forward, we would expect that to become more technical and more detailed in terms of the discussions that will be held with the various providers, because there would be issues about how the system would actually work, making sure that assumptions and discussions so far stood the test, stood further testing to make sure that we got it absolutely right. So we would certainly, it is the case that we have been having discussions with both UK CSPs and overseas CSPs, and we'll continue to do so.
Those discussions, were they specifically about the draft bill, or were they just discussions in the past about communications data in general?
I think they've been of both types, Lord Brencathra. It started off being more general, but have then become more specific about the bill, about the requirements, about how those requirements could be met, and about what any powers in a bill should be.
Most of the telecoms operators tell us that the first discussions they had on the specific provisions in this draft bill were after publication, and some of the CSPs say the first consultation they had was the day after we summoned to give them evidence.
Well, certainly, I mean, we're into a definitional issue here, I think, in the sense that it's only possible to consult on aspects that are in a draft bill when the draft bill has been published. It is possible to discuss the issues that then come into clauses, become clauses in a draft bill, afterwards.
Thank you, Home Secretary. I think you've been a very careful choice of language. I congratulate you on that.
If I can
carry on.
Move on to another group, and we haven't been able to talk to anything like all of these, but we have had a lot of representations from members of the general public about this issue, and those who have contacted this committee, and there's been very many thousands, I believe, have been almost uniformly hostile to the bill, very, very critical of the breadth of the powers as set out in the legislation, which may be different from what the Home Office intends. You may also be aware that there was a YouGov poll done for Big Brother Watch, which found that 6% of people thought that the government had made a clear and compelling case for the bill. There is a lot of very genuine concern about this bill and the effective intrusion into private lives, given the breadth of it. What steps will you take to try to reassure people that isn't something they should be concerned about?
Well, I'm aware that there has been a lot of concern based partly on the publicity around the bill, which portrayed, I would say, a number of myths about the bill, such as it was going to enable the government to read everybody's emails, which it plainly obviously is not. I think the other aspect that people we've not got across to people is that this is not the case that the government is going to be seeing the who, what, where and how of every single person's communications. It will, of course, only be possible that data will be retained by the CSPs, but it will only be possible for law enforcement agencies to have access to it when they have an investigative reason for doing so. And they have to make a clear case. It goes through the process. I believe that the committee has visited the Met and seen the single point of contact operation, seen the process that is gone through to make sure that only in cases where it is indeed necessary in an investigation is that data required. And of course, it is the case that not just that data has played such a significant role in so many serious and organised crime cases and terrorist investigations, but I think it was between April and June of this year that in the London area, it was something like, I may need to check these figures, but 46 out of 53 prosecutions from the CPS, this data was part of those prosecutions. So it's not just the police accessing it in investigation, it goes through into prosecutions. And if I may, Dr. Happert, I believe that I did not say in the Sun article, I don't have it in front of me, I did not say it would only be used in relation to serious crime, terrorism.
I think the exact quote is, no one is going to be looking through ordinary people's emails or Facebook posts. Only suspected terrorists, paedophiles or serious criminals will be investigated. It is for what it's worth, the quote, but that was back in April. If I can just ask one final question, Lord Chairman. There has been a lot of misinformation around this and a lot of lack of clarity. I think we'd all agree with that. Given that, are you therefore grateful we've had the chance to go through this pre-legislative process where people, yourself, police, other people have had the chance to state publicly what they think about this, and that it has highlighted a number of things which your officials already accepted would need to be updated in the bill?
I certainly think this has been a good process. I think, as I say, I'm conscious of the length of time you were given to do this, but I think it has shown an open and public discussion about this in a way that's been very important. Obviously, I think some of the evidence that you've received from the police has highlighted the operational necessity of this. And I think that has perhaps, hopefully, sent a message which we previously had not been able to get across to people.
Strasbourg?
If this bill were enacted, there would be a massive increase in the data being held about every citizen who uses the internet. This data would be a honeypot for casual hackers, blackmailers, criminals large and small all over the world, and foreign states. Given the woeful record of public and private sector organisations in protecting data they hold from loss or theft, why should the public have any confidence that their private and financially valuable data will remain secure?
Well, security of data is always a concern for people in their everyday life, in the way in which they use data today, let alone this. I mean, it is not the case that suddenly people should start worrying when they don't need to worry today. I mean, I think people need, one of my personal concerns is that a lot of people probably don't handle their data in as a secure a way today as they could be handling it. But I don't think this is not about the public sector. You said the public sector has woeful. And the private sector. But just let's get the public sector out of the way, because this is not data that is going to be held by the public sector. This is data that will be held by the private sector, by the CSPs. Obviously, we've been talking to them about the security of that data. There will be, as you know, some sanctions in the bill in terms of any breaches in relation to the security of that data. We will be doing everything we can to ensure that that data is held securely as the data is held today. I mean, CSPs are holding significant amounts of data about people's communications as we speak. This is not a new concept.
The bill will require the CSPs to hold a lot more data, a wider range of data, and 12 months data. What will be new is there'll be a lot more data about a lot more things being held.
Well, they will be holding more data. They will be retaining it for 12 months. That's what they do on data, some of the data anyway, today. So the concept of the private sector holding data and whether or not that is secure for individuals is not changed by the nature of this bill.
We've heard from experts, including some of the CSPs, that they actually have concerns about their ability to withstand attacks given the increased amount of data and the increased attractiveness of this data. And I mean, I've got a list here of some of the breaches that we know about in private sector organisations: NASA, Microsoft, Yahoo, Bank of America, Citigroup, Apple, have all, LinkedIn had 6.5 million passwords stolen a few months ago. They're all vulnerable, and the fact that this data is being expanded and is going to hold arguably some very private information, many people are concerned that this data will get out there. In fact, some of the experts have told us this data will get out.
Well, first of all, if I come back to the central point of why we're doing this, which is the who, when, where and how, that is the data that we will be requiring to be held. That's what we want to be able to have access to. That sort of data is held already. I'm aware of the issue that you raise about issues with systems today. The fact that there is going to be a different set of data in the sense of different communications forms for the same type of data, and that's going to be held, does not change that, I don't think changes that principle. And government has to take a decision. We have to decide whether we want our law enforcement agencies to be able to carry on doing what they have been doing, which is bringing people to justice and saving lives, or not.
Mr. Mosley?
The weakest point of any computer system is the human. You talked about sanctions, but as I understand it, most of those sanctions are on the CSPs to make sure that they protect their data. What about the situation where people in authority, whether it's the police or the organisations, misuse access to that data? Do you think there should be criminal sanctions in that situation?
Well, there are already procedures in place. If somebody in the police misuses access to some form of data, then it is already possible to take some action against those officers. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, you see, if an officer misuses access to the police national computer, and that's identified, then action is taken against that, can be taken against that officer. So I think there will already be procedures in place that would enable some form of action to be taken.
So, Mr. Whittaker, then Mr. Brown.
Sorry, did you want to finish?
Well, I was just going to say, and obviously it is already the case also that this is not just about misconduct. In some circumstances, if it can be seen that there is an element of criminality in terms of, I'm trying to think of, misuse in public office, misconduct in public office, or something like those, then action can be taken on those lines.
Secretary, I don't think we've seen any examples of police breaking the rules, but do you think it would show even-handedness to the public and help reassure them if there's criminal sanctions for the CSPs or the internet service providers who break the rules, and there's equally serious criminal sanctions for the police officers, even although we have no evidence that police have actually done it?
Yeah. Well, certainly I've seen no evidence that the police have mishandled or misused any of this information that they've had access to up till now. I think what I'm trying to say is that there are already sanctions which may be of a slightly different kind from the sanctions that appear on the face of the bill, but sanctions are already available in relation to the police should they misuse data.
Thank you. Mr. Whittaker.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Good afternoon. We've heard a lot about the spirit of the bill, and we also heard in evidence that large CSPs will probably be the only ones asked to collect this information. The face of the bill doesn't say that at all, so you can understand why some people are sceptical. I want to ask you about SMEs who don't have the personnel to perform some of the tasks that will need to be done to collect data. And I want to ask you what risk assessment's been done around SMEs and what damage that will do to business setups in this field and indeed innovation in the UK in this field.
Well, we've looked at that issue. On the innovation point, I think I'm right in saying that the Business Department, the Minister, for Science, David Willits, in the Business Department's evidence, set out clearly that they did not see that this would in any way harm innovation in the UK. In relation to SMEs, you're absolutely right that it, as we've made clear, I mean, there will be certain CSPs that the government would be naturally dealing with. There will be some CSPs, very small CSPs and startups, where that would not necessarily be doing so. If it were felt necessary because of any evidence that we should be doing that, then of course appropriate discussions would be held with those bodies about their capabilities and how this could be managed. But it's not the intention, as you've said, to suddenly have an interaction with every single CSP, because we're conscious, as you say, that there will be some smaller providers who don't have the capability to be able to do what is being requested.
Lord Strasbourg.
When agreeing the policy of the draft bill, you were of course aware of the views of the intelligence, security and law enforcement agencies that their work requires additional access to communications data. Did you, before deciding on the breadth of the new powers, consult any of the organisations concerned with protecting privacy and human rights?
Well, there have been, throughout the course of this, a number of discussions with certain organisations about their views on this.
Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, I mean, it's I can look at the people that, I mean, for example, I have had a very early discussion on this and a number of other matters with certainly one organisation. And officials will have been discussing and had other people in and had meetings, have had a number of meetings with individuals and organisations who take a different view from the government.
But you personally have not had very many by the sounds of it?
No, because that would naturally be conducted normally by officials, and obviously they would feed back the information to me.
Mr. Brown.
We touched on the offence of misconduct in public office in your earlier reply to us. The general public, our constituents, are frightened that they're going to be spied on, and that people who will obtain information about them, perhaps unlawfully obtain information about them, and that somehow it will then come into the public domain. Now, one way of reassuring the general public would be to ensure that those who break the law are caught and punished. The Information Commissioner said to us, he repeated a call that he's made before, that if we enacted Section 77 and 78 of the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act 2008, that would meet the case. In other words, the offences are already set out in legislation, but they haven't been enacted. What would your view be on bringing in a modern and proportionate offence that could be prosecuted?
I think in relation to the particular offences in the 2008 Act, if I may, Mr Brown, I'd like to go away and have a look at the specifics in that and perhaps write to the committee on that point. I appreciate the point that the committee is making, that the public want to know that if somebody does bad things with their information and things they shouldn't be doing with their information, that there is going to be some sanction on that individual, an appropriate sanction on that individual. How that is undertaken, whether it's new powers or not, I think is a question that would need to be looked at. And I'm happy to look at the specific offences that are in that 2008 Act.
I'm happy with that, Chairman.
Lord Foulkes?
Secretary, I think that particular point was one that was raised before Lord Leveson, and I think it's likely that he may have some observations to come when he produces the report fairly shortly.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Lord Armstrong.
Thank you very much, Lord Chairman. If I may revert for a moment to the permitted purposes in Clause 9 of the Bill. As I understand it, Clause 9 repeats the 10 purposes which are derived from RIPA, and then Clause 9(7) would allow you to add further purposes. The House of Lords Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee have said that they would not necessarily find that extra power acceptable just because it derives from the existing power in RIPA, which they, at the time, they thought too wide. So I wonder what, if somebody came to you and said they wanted to extend the permitted purposes, what justification you would be expected to require?
Well, I mean, the first answer would be that this would need to be a purpose which I felt was necessary and proportionate in its operation. I mean, the examples of powers that have been added in recent years, I think the last time a change was made to existing powers was in 2006, and that was to added purposes relating to investigations into miscarriage of justice. And identifying the obtaining of information about persons who have died who are unable to identify themselves, which came in an order in 2010. I think what I hope is that shows the sort of nature of purpose that might be used as an extension in relation to this. But it would have to be necessary and proportionate. It would have to be something where there was clearly a public benefit for adding that purpose, which outweighed the concerns that there might be about that information being accessed for that purpose.
Thank you, Secretary of State. If I may turn from that to the public authorities, in Clause 21 of the Bill, that gives you powers to... the Bill defines the 4 relevant public authorities with access to communications data. Clause 21 would give you power to add to that list. Your memorandum says that circumstances may change over time, such that an existing body may be able to present a compelling case for the designation. It rather looks as if you don't really believe that any other body than the 4 relevant public authorities, the police and so on, really need to be designated. But we've seen cases made to you for extension. I would be glad to know whether you think you are going to need to designate a number of other public bodies beyond the 4.
I think it's been a very good exercise for us to not assume that the existing list of public authorities should naturally translate into the new bill, but to ask those beyond those that clearly are the majority users of the communications data currently, to ask each public authority to justify its access. Now, in some cases, they don't have very many cases that they requests that they make. In others, it looks quite small in compared to, say, the police, but actually is a reasonable number in relation to the agencies. I think currently my view is that there are those for which it is possible to make a case. I think I would cite, for example, UK Borders Agency, and I've already mentioned Financial Services Authority. I think further than that, there are others that we are still looking at to see, and there will be some where actually a good case has not been made.
Would you be prepared to consider whether any other bodies, additional bodies which were designated, should, when applying for access to data, need to go through a procedure more rigorous than that required of the Police Intelligence Services and those other, SOCA and HMRC? For instance, something like the National Anti-Fraud Network, which I believe is a central institution which can handle local authority applications and has the expertise, the SPOCs and all that required to do so. Would it be in your thoughts that if there were other bodies than the Serious Crime and Intelligence Security Agencies designated, that they might be put through a more rigorous procedure through some kind of central body like that?
I have a natural disinclination to creating new central bodies, but I think what we would need to do would be to look at each individual case and the extent to which they were able to show that they had sufficiently robust procedures or were able to provide sufficiently robust procedures before then looking at to whether there was a number of organisations perhaps where it was felt that a central body would be more appropriate. I mean, the difficulty is obviously for those bodies who don't use this very often, ensuring that they have a truly robust process, i.e. that somebody actually understands the full process, because they're used to, the police are used to doing it. They know they've got an operation that is streamlined, is smooth. Some of the organisations that have request access very irregularly, I think there's a question first of all as to whether it's right for them to continue to have access, and then if they do, how it is appropriate to make sure that the public can have confidence that they're not doing this capriciously, that they are doing it properly.
That sounds as if your mind is not closed to the idea of some kind of central point for these other authorities. There is some suggestion, at the moment each separate police service has its own systems of authorization for access to communications data. There is some suggestion that there might be a case for centralizing some of that. Some of the smaller police authorities might conceivably go to a central police pool of SPOCs and so on, which could actually, the central body would have the expertise and the experience to handle it, and it would save the smaller authorities having to develop their own authorization procedures.
Yes, on the first remark, if I may, Lord Armstrong, I think it would be ill-mannered of me to come before a joint scrutiny committee and say that I was closed to absolutely any proposals that the joint scrutiny committee might choose to bring up in its report. I'd not considered fully the question of police forces going to a central point. I think my view would be that police forces actually are able to provide the robust processes internally. They have, they are more used to dealing with this sort of request, and I think they have naturally the proper structures and hierarchies and processes in place that enable them to make these sorts of requests properly without having to go to a central authority.
I think, Home Secretary, we've heard that Devon and Cornwall, Wiltshire and possibly another force have decided to centralise their SPOC system for reasons of efficiency and higher quality training and so on. So if that were to be the case, you would not be averse to other police forces without amalgamating police forces, at least sharing their SPOC resource.
There are many good examples of police forces who are now sharing resources across a variety of different areas. If they choose to do so, because it makes sense for them and is efficient, I think then I'm very happy for them to do so. What I'm less willing to go down the route of is to say that the government will mandate that they will all go through a certain structure, because they need to, if they're going to do share services, they need to do it with the forces that make sense to them, where they've got some natural affinities, where it's going to work, where perhaps they're sharing other resources as well.
Before we leave, I know to other colleagues, before we leave, Home Secretary, we've got a division in the Commons. Right. I trust you're okay to come back in 10 minutes' time?
Yes.
We'll try to reconvene as soon as the Home Secretary is back. Thank you very much. Suspended for a limited amount of time. Okay, yeah, probably nearer the end. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we'll near it.
Well, I don't know that.
Yeah, okay, can do it, yeah. Yeah, and we'll...
She spent some time on the bridge. Yes. No, the team in the corner are offering the right body language, I think, to suggest that combination.
Committee Room 3, sound.